This is just a brief summary of the main points of the Valve case, and I just wanted to start out with a little bit of background about Valve, and many of you, hopefully as a result of the case, perhaps looked a little more into this, but these are just some pictures of Valve. Their headquarters are kind of in a nondescript office tower in Bellevue, Washington, but this is what you might see as you enter Valve. But the background on Valve, it's quite an interesting company. It has about 400 employees, so one thing to think a little bit about, I guess, as we think about organizational structure and different kinds of organizational structures, are concerns about size and how you scale size and where different sorts of approaches and designs might work. But by all means, this is a rather successful company. It's survived for 20 plus years. It's really fascinating to say that they've grown about 50% a year for every single year of their existence. And they're extremely successful in that their revenue per employee is significantly greater than either Apple or Microsoft. And they have over 1.25 million users accounts involved in their gaming experiences, simultaneous users, right? So this is an important thing to think about. I'm not a gamer myself, but it's been focused on PC gaming and some versions of cloud-based gaming versus console type gaming like the Wii or other things or Xboxes. We can think what we might think about this in terms of the value of the organization and what it's doing, but they, as a company, have been identified as being among the top 5 consumer users of bandwidth worldwide when we compare that even against nations and countries. And some of the games that they are known for are listed over here. It will be interesting to know if in the conversations you had in your groups, if you have classmates who game or know these games or have maybe family members or kids do. This is just part of the entryway and hallways in Valve, looking at all the places in the different various magazines that they've been covered and many, many awards that they've won. So again, some evidence of this being, by all means, a very, very successful organization. So I asked you in the case questions and in the worksheet to talk a little bit about, what problems does Valve need to solve. Now, the reason we ask that is when we think about creating the formal structure of an organization, it should support the most important strategic activities of the organization. So two that I can think of when I look at the Valve case are the need for recruiting, identifying, kind of hiring and retaining motivated, very equipped top talent, right? Very creative people. And as we'll talk about in this structure, very self-starting, self-motivated people. But in addition to that, there has to be some way to get people to actually coordinate their activities. So if you look at the note on organizational structure by Bernstein and Noria, that first thing is coordinated capabilities. And if we think about the top talent in these people, really nothing's going to happen unless there's some mechanism for them to be able to understand how to work together to produce these award-winning products that this organization has produced. So I think in a more concrete way to look at this, if we think about the top talent here and the iterative process, the processes here are the structures. So if we think about most traditional organizational designs where there's the hierarchy and the chain of command and departmentalization, we don't see those things here at Valve. And an important point to take away from this case is that formal structure can happen in a lot of different ways. And in some of the so-called new forms of organizations like holacracies or crowd-centric or employee-centric organizational structures, it may not be formal decision rules and formal chains of command that provide that structure, but it might be, kind of specified processes or understood processes. And so I had you read the Valve Handbook, and if you didn't have a chance to dig into that too far, I would argue to you that that's the source and form of structure here. So that handbook is providing employees with an understanding of expectations of how work gets done. And ultimately, in organizational structure or formal control, that's what we're doing, is we need to guide people and set those expectations. Although I would say Valve is on a far end of informal design and a lot of autonomy and choice made by employees. But if you think about the process about what has to happen to make these games, first of all, somehow people have to generate ideas. So there has to be a process in place by which people understand their role and that anyone really can come up with ideas. But then somehow, one way or the other, people or the organization needs to choose ideas that get moved forward. And one of those ways in this organization it appears is just a very substantial informal influence process, right? That we go back to power and politics, and part of this is people being able to go out to their peers, engage in some of those X-team behaviors like ambassadorship and try to sell an idea, because the organizing unit here then is the cabal. And somehow an idea has to come from one or a group of people and then get marketed to others enough to attract people to kind of come and form a cabal around that. And once the idea gets kicked off and going, then the next sort of phases of the process are to storyboard the game. So you have to think about what kind of resources do you have to attract to your unit, your working unit of a cabal. You might need artists, you might need people who can mock up prototypes and that sort of thing in storyboarding, and then we have to move this into programming. The people can actually turn this into code to turn it into a game. Once that's done, there has to be a series of testing and kind of iterating through fixing bugs and deciding at what point to release this out to customers. But another really important takeaway point about Valve is that there's really blurry boundaries between what's in the organization, what's outside the organization. In fact, they appear to, ship products, I think not intentionally with bugs, but certainly with the possibility of modification. And as part of the community of gamers, that people know how to code, and they might actually create their own scenarios for the game to extend the game. And Valve allows that. And in that sense, it's an interesting way to think about the fact that this organization doesn't have as strong a boundary as many of the ones we're used to working in terms of who works for the organization and who doesn't work for the organization. And it's also very interesting to see how Valve has, in fact, captured resources by hiring in individuals or groups who have gone on to program these modules for their games. But important things to take away here is that for this to work, this has to be a strategy of this organization that in fact, effectiveness is more important than efficiency. So it should, I think, be clear that this kind of organizing is probably time-consuming, and it probably has a bunch of inefficiencies in terms of how people have to move in and out of these cabals, decide to market their ideas, try to attract people over to one group from another group. When we don't have a chain of command or the idea of the hierarchy or leadership or decision makers constructing that environment, that can be a more efficient way when people are assigning people and using the power of the authority and the hierarchy to do that instead of it kind of organically happening. That's not going to be a very efficient process. So think through things like, well, what would make that be possible? Maybe it's creative industries or entertainment. It's high margin industries where you need people who are willing to work in that environment, the people who might only want to have that sort of self-control over their work might be the people you need to attract. So some of those things are ways we think about matching or fitting structure with our strategy. They don't need long-term employee-based growth. They're not, they don't necessarily have to have a lot more employees to get more productivity or gains. So they can do a lot with the people they have and rearrange and restructure and reconfigure many times over with the kind of people who are working there. And ultimately, there's quite a lot of discretion and outputs happening here. On this outside side for the iterative process, you have to assume that there's going to be these passionate consumers who are going to give you feedback and actually participate in designing some of your products, that you are in the center of distribution for this ecosystem of games, that really you don't have to think about much of a supply chain other than you immediately put it out there on your platform of delivery, and customers immediately can access and interact with it. You don't have really any supplier relationships, so you don't need the same kind of boundary control as you might in an organization that has a very significant interaction with external stakeholders and suppliers, for example, and it's a very low capital intensity organization. If you look at some videos about Valve, certainly there's capital involved in some of the computing machines, some of the probably 3D printers and other things to make prototypes and green screen actors and other things, but comparatively to a lot of other industries, it's a pretty low capital intensity industry. So kind of in conclusion here, if you think about Valve versus traditional companies, and I think that's one of the most interesting parts about this, is it's not a company that, like many that we are used to working in. Valve is a flat organization, and you read some articles about the risks around flat organizations, so it's interesting to think about, what do you think Valve's risks are in terms of growth, in terms of when they get maybe a competitive challenge, etc. But the contrast, is a traditional company is hierarchical and has managers leading things, and there's decision-making authority that's relatively more centralized in Valve. Valve has the ultimate in terms of intrinsic motivation in autonomy and self-structured time. People move their desks, right? So that's a fascinating thing. You can Google and take a look. There's some videos around about how they move their desks. So people can just choose to work in a group, choose not to work in a group, decide that a group isn't really being productive, and decide to take their personal resources somewhere else. And there's obviously an ongoing negotiation among people to try to pull people, into or influence them into your cabals. So in traditional organizations, there are job descriptions that people are relatively permanently attached to. And here, it's really people deciding to put their resources into different projects. Most companies, have divisions and segments. People are in fixed geographic spots and offices. Valve, on the other hand, is flexible. People move their desks. They can decide. And ultimately, there's this peer review versus a manager review. So it's much more of a horizontal evaluation of your performance. We're going to talk a lot about T-shaped people in the collaboration segment in just a little bit, but they need people who have deep expertise but also know how to bridge across, and it's inside the person that the integration comes from, and maybe not as much inside the formal structure in terms of getting horizontal collaboration and cooperation to happen. So, I think all in all, we can see there's some very strong differences between how a traditional company structures itself in a more permanent type of organizational formal control, and how Valve has this much more organic and fluid thing. The core takeaway here is that there is still a source of structure. And when we think about Valve, it's coming from the founder, Gabe, and it's coming from his vision and the culture that's in place in this organization. And so in a way, this is going to bleed a little bit into our informal control through culture and values, but this is also coming from processes and routines that are set up by the leadership of this organization and ingrained in people and delivered through the handbook and through other kind of hands-on personal learning. So I think that the key thing to take away is that there is structure here. It's not coming from the traditional ways we think it is, and for you and your team just to think about what you find interesting about that. Which among you would think you'd like to work there and why? What would make you uncomfortable with this? And then ultimately, what risks do you see coming from this design at Valve? One thing to ask yourself is there are other gaming companies, there are other entertainment companies that do organize themselves in more traditional ways. So it is a good illustration to show us that there are many different ways to get to being a successful organization, even in the same industry, even creating some of the same products. But something about Valve is obviously creating a competitive advantage, and there's something about the way they've structured themselves that has allowed them to do some things that other companies have not been able to. So those are, more questions and food for thought to take away, but I just wanted to at least point those things out in terms of the major features of the case as you read it.